A very good morning to you. My name is Hermann Pretorius. I am Head of Strategic Communications for the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. Welcome to today's webinar, where I will be sharing the IRR's 2026 opinion polling on the state of race and race relations in South Africa. Now, I just want to insert a caveat here. A technical caveat is my internet connection has been working relatively well this morning. However, just before we went on air now, it gave a slight hiccup. So if my face suddenly pixelates, I'm sure the aesthetic cost will be minimal, and but the functional cost might be a bit more. However, we soldier on. So I apologize in advance were that to happen. But let us get to the matter at hand. The Institute of Race Relations has for many, many years conducted opinion polling about South Africa, and we do this on an annual basis. We cover three areas of interest in the main, with, of course, some additional ad hoc issues attached. Firstly, of course, as the Institute of Race Relations, we investigate the state of race relations in South Africa. We, of course, also poll the political state of play in the country, and then we poll policy preferences. Today, we will be looking specifically at our findings on race relations. I will try to get through the presentation as speedily as possible, yet without compromising analytical use, so that we can get to some questions and answers where I will be more than happy to take any questions that you might have. So we start, of course, with the essentials of where this presentation from and where it lands up. Firstly, we will look at some key findings. Then I will take you through our methodology and why we believe it is credible. Then I will go through some analysis of the findings, and then we will reach some conclusions. So starting with key findings. Firstly, the finding is that most South Africans reject continued race-based allocation by the state. 70% of South Africans say the government should not continue using apartheid-era race categories to decide who qualifies for business and job opportunities, while 27% say it should. This includes 64% of Black respondents, 85% of colored respondents, 74% of Indian respondents, and 97% of white. So you could see a cross-racial endorsement of discontinuing apartheid-era race categories. We will get into this question a bit later on, but the key finding stands. Number two, the public remains strongly committed to interracial cooperation, with 89% agreeing that the different races need each other for progress and that there should be full opportunity for people of all colors. Interestingly, this is up from 84% in 2025. However, a caveat with regards to comparisons, try not to pay too much attention to the numbers going up or down from one year to the next, especially if there are small shifts like 5%. What we should focus on is perhaps the larger picture, and that is, in this case, that almost 9 out of 10 South Africans, or between at least 8 out of 10 and 9 out of 10 South Africans believe that the races of South Africa need each other for progress and that there should be full opportunity for people of all colors. Finding number 3, economic upliftment is seen as the route beyond racial inequality. This is a well-known question in the IRR's surveys, with a consistent 3/4 majority taking the position as shown again in the 2026 findings, where 76% agree that better education and more jobs will steadily reduce inequality between the races. This is up, for some context, from 73% in 2025, but once again, that's more for a linear context to show that this number remains high and around the 75% mark. Agreement on this stands 5% among Black respondents, 76% among colored respondents, 80% among Indians, and 87% among whites. Key finding number 4, perceptions of social expectations about the presidency are more racial than personal preferences. This is a fascinating new finding, a new question that we've inserted in our polling. And when we get to unpacking it in a bit of more depth, you'll see why I say it is such a fascinating one. 47% of South Africans think most other South Africans believe the president must be Black, yet only 34% themselves say they would only or preferably support a Black president. 2/3 majority, 66%, say they would support the best person for the job of president, regardless of race. Finding number 5, racism remains real, but is not most heavily reported by the poorest. This is a very important finding, and we'll get to it a bit later. But what the overall figures show is that 44% of South Africans report a personal experience of racism in the last 5 years. That differs slightly from 48% in 2025. However, to give you some context, only 30% of households under 2,000 Rand report such an experience, or respondents from such households report experiencing racism in the last 5 years, only 30% of them. This rises to 54% among the top earners. Finding number 6, reported personal experiences of racism stands at 64% among Freedom Front Plus voters, 63% among MK voters, 56% among PA voters, and 50% among the EFF voters. This points to a mutually reinforcing relationship between grievance-sensitive voters and grievance-based parties. So, am I stuck? I've just received a message that I am indeed stuck on my slide. That is not positive. Let me perhaps quickly unshare. There we go. I am hoping it is moving on. Let me just quickly check in with our technical team. My apologies. Have sorted what there might have been. I do apologize. We will, of course, upload the slides to the IRR's website, and all of the findings I am discussing now are to be found within the presentation as we go on. So I hope you haven't missed anything too vital. These are just the key findings, but they will be, of course, repeated as we proceed. So then moving on to key finding number 7, and this is also a very appropriate finding to the time. South Africans reject extreme racial threat narratives. President Donald Trump's white genocide claim is rejected by 72% of South Africans. There seems to be a bit of a lag with the slides again. Do excuse me. Let me just once again get in touch with our technical team. My apologies, but the technical team have made an alternative plan that seems to be working. So on point number 7, key finding number 7, South Africans reject extreme racial threat narratives. President Trump's white genocide claim is rejected by 72% of South Africans and only accepted by 19%. Among white South Africans, this changes to 50% disagreeing with President Trump, 37% agreeing. So white South Africans, perhaps naturally within the context of the question and the sense of victimhood, is perhaps an expected disproportion in terms of the national picture. Then our final key finding, the public remains deeply skeptical of elite race rhetoric. 70% of South Africans agree that politicians use racism and colonialism to excuse their failures, including 67% of Black respondents, 73% of ANC supporters, and roughly the same number of 71% of DA supporters. With those key findings and hopefully any further technical bugs behind us, let us move on to the meat and potatoes, as it were, of polling, the methodological questions. Now, this is really where any opinion survey or opinion polling stands or falls, and it is important for us to be as transparent as we can be about our methodology. The survey was conducted from the 9th to the 20th of March 2026. We had a sample size of 1,038. This is up from 807 last year, and I would like to extend our gratitude to our colleagues over at IRR Legal, who ensured that our sample size can be thus expanded. And I would urge you to keep an eye out for work from the IRR Legal Department on what might be forthcoming from the opinion polling in terms of legal matters that might arise over the coming weeks. Our screening process included only registered voters. The margin of error is plus minus 3%, and the confidence level is 95. When looking at securing a credible methodology, of course, step 1 is questionnaire design. We have to make sure that we do not ask leading questions, that the questions are clear, that they are relevant to the experiences of our respondents, that they are balanced. And some of the key components of this, of course, include making sure structurally that questions are grouped thematically, that they cover sensible topics that we want to find information on. The wording of the questions ought to be as neutral as possible to avoid influencing respondents' answers, and the questions we asked will be shared on the slides when we discuss them. And then, of course, where necessary, follow-up questions are put. to ascertain perhaps some deeper level of understanding when it comes to topics that are perhaps more multi-level than simply a yes or a no, but making sure that we bring the respondent along in the conversation throughout the survey taking. Then beyond questionnaire design, of course, data weighting is crucial to making sure that the polling sample reflects the South African situation. And let me pause here for a moment, perhaps, just to make some remarks about some common misunderstandings about what makes an opinion poll accurate or not. Some people assume that sample size is the be-all and end-all of opinion polling. Now, whilst sample size matters, it is certainly not the be-all and end-all. For an example, if I were to walk to Loftus Versfeld Stadium when the Bulls are playing a match, the capacity crowd, I'm not sure if it's 50 or 60,000, but let's say it's 60,000. If I were to then ask 60,000 people which sport is the best sport in the world, I might have a sample size of 60 or 50,000, but the answer being asked at a rugby game at a rugby stadium would, of course, not be truly reflective. So sample size alone isn't what makes a polling method credible or not. That said, sample size is important, at least as a baseline. And the mathematics show us that a sample below 600 is really a troublesome one. And one could almost envision it with a coin flip, a very simple example that we know has a 50-50 chance to be either heads or tails. If I flip the coin once, then I will either have 100% heads or 100% tails. If I flip it again, I might have still 100% heads or 100% tails, but I might have 50-50. If I flip it a third time, the picture changes, but still it is entirely possible for me to have 300s of heads in a row, 300% throws or flips of that land on heads, which of course conflicts with the reality that a coin is a 50-50 concept. So if we keep on flipping this coin, once we get to about 600 flips, the data tells us that we are reaching something of a representative sample where roughly 50% of the time we will see heads, roughly 50% of the time we will see tails. Now, of course, as you continue climbing up those numbers, you converge on a point of accuracy, and yet it is important to note that there are diminishing returns in terms of opinion polling. There are, of course, instances where you want a sample size of 10,000 or 20,000, but that is quite often when you're looking at decimal points of difference. If, for example, the stats SA need to know the difference between 37.5% unemployment and 37.2% unemployment. That is where massive samples of 10 and 20,000 really becomes important. But when we are dealing with rather more straightforward questions like this survey does, or when it deals with political questions in the United States, or in America, or in Germany, or in Britain, or in Germany, a sample size of between 800 and 1,200 is considered standard and global best practice. However, the sample size in and of itself needs to be weighted. It needs to represent the population group or the population collective that you are trying to understand the views of. And in that sense, our sample of 1,038 has been structured so that by age, by gender, by province, by urban or rural residency, etc., it represents an accurate picture of the South African population as a whole. So sample size is important, and we are satisfied that our sample of 1,038 is in line with international best practice. We are also satisfied on the second point that it is representative, that by race, by language, by age, gender, province, all of by income, by employment status, by education levels, that by all these metrics, this sample represents fairly and accurately the national population of South Africa. And that is what is meant by weighting, to ensure that the sample corresponds with the population as a whole. For some interest, the data on geographic distribution is on the screen, showing that Gauteng had 23.8% of respondents, KwaZulu-Natal 21.2, etc., all the way down to the Northern Cape on 2.1. Residential distribution, the largest group represented in the survey are township residents on 34.7%, followed by tribal land inhabitants, 33%, suburbs, 16.8%, central business districts or CBDs, 6.7%, informal settlement, 6.2%, small holdings, 1.7%, and commercial farming, 0.9%. By age, a similar picture emerges. The data will be in the slides and the report. I won't go through it individually in the interest of time. And similarly with language, isiZulu speakers, 24.8%, isiXhosa, 18.8%, English, 11.4%, Afrikaans 11.3%, Sesotho 6.4% of respondents, and other languages 27.3%. Income levels, the same story. Note that the most important bracket in this instance is the 2,000 to 8,000 per month income bracket by household. That's 53.6% in the survey, making that group very, very important, not just in the survey, but in the nation as a whole. The last point before I move on to analysis of our findings on methodology is that randomness is the third and final component of ensuring credible sampling. Sample size, representativity, and randomness. Every South African needs to have the same chance of being included in this survey for it to have merit and integrity. Due to the fact that the South African population has a very, very high ownership rate, roughly about 94% of cell phones, using cell phone numbers and a randomized generator of South African cell phone numbers, we can ensure a credible level of randomness. So combining sample size, representativity, and randomness, we end up in a situation where our methodology really passes the muster and we can have confidence in our findings with the 3% margin of error always kept in mind. Moving on to the analysis of our findings. Now, this is where we start seeing the meat and the bones of our findings today. Firstly, we look at race, political legitimacy, and the presidency. We asked respondents this question. During apartheid, the government categorized every South African as white, black, colored, or Indian. Today, the government sometimes uses those same race categories to decide who should qualify for business and job opportunities and who should not. Which of the following comes closest to your view on this issue? The government should continue to use race in this way, 27% support. The government should not continue to use race in this way, 70% support. This is a very, very interesting finding showing an innate moderate stance on race relations, and it is not one that only relies on one race group. The clear majority consistently at 60% or above is found across the racial groups. Now, of course, in opinion polling, when you start delving into the smaller groupings like we do here, it does affect the overall margin of error. Our margin of error is 1,083 for the 1,038 total sample size, the margin of error is 3. But once you start subdividing that total 1,000 sample into smaller groups, you do enter some territory of perhaps more noise. But the fact that the majority in this instance on this question remains consistent is a clear indication that even with that margin of error expanding as the groups become smaller in the larger sample, it is clear that this is a representative finding across all race groups. So at minimum, a roughly 2/3 finding in favor of an abandonment of the racial classification groupings of those four racial groups created by the Population Registration Act of 1950. To take further cognizance of what South Africans consider when they think about the state and the state's role and the state's relation to the issue of race, we ask South Africans whether they agree or disagree with the following statement. Most other South Africans, in other words, other than yourself, believe that the president must be black. Now, what's very, very interesting here is that we get a near perfect split of 48-48, with the remaining 4% either undecided or unsure. And just for clarity, those undecideds and unsure numbers have been left out of the graphs that I'll be presenting today, just for simplifying visual use. But you can see it's a 48-48 split down the middle, essentially a 50-50 split of South Africans thinking that generally other South Africans agree that the president must be black. Now, this question in and of itself might give the indication of a racially tense country. But if we then move on to understanding it in the broader context of people's own views, when we no longer ask what you think others think, but what you think, individuals, not taking into account the idea of the zeitgeist or general opinion, when we make it very applicable to the individual, a significantly different picture emerges, where 66% of South Africans endorse the position, I will support the best person to be president, regardless of their race. Now, if we break that down by racial category, it differs across the various racial groups, and perhaps it makes absolute sense that the largest contingent of those who say a black president, I will only support a black person to be president, comes from black South Africans, similar to the question of white experiences of victimhood in terms of policies like BE. So that's entirely predictable. It's entirely rational for that population group to present a number like this. However, 13% of black South Africans say that they would prefer to support a black person to be president, but are open to other options. And even with those numbers larger than the national overall picture, 58% of black South Africans say they will support the best person for the job of president, regardless of their race. It is very important when we look at the questions of race, political legitimacy, and the presidency to take these three questions sort of together. Number one, South Africans reject the state's role as a racial arbiter and classifier and corresponding source of benefit or detriment based on race, especially if connected to the fact that the four categories of race in use today are the four categories that were created for such use by the 1950s Population Registration Act. Secondly, there is the suspicion of more racialized political thinking when it comes to the presidency than is reflected by reality. The fact that 48% of South Africans can respond and say others would prefer a black president, when the reality is actually that 66% of South Africans do not see race as a qualifier or disqualifier for the presidency is an indication that that roughly 15 to 20 percentage point gap is a source of quite unnecessary suspicion and tension. South Africans are more on the same page when it comes to de-racialized politics, is even in an office as high as that of the president, than they might themselves suspect, which is, as my colleague Gabriel Krause once put it quite succinctly, it is a crisis of common knowledge. I know I should drive on the left-hand side of the road. You know you should drive on the left-hand side of the road. But if I don't know that you know, and you don't know that I know, when we pass each other, despite our subjective opinion being on the same page, there is this moment of tension of can things go wrong? It is a moment of social friction, despite two people driving on the road in opposite directions, having the same understanding of the rules of the road. However, if I know that I should drive on the left-hand side of the road and you approach me from the front and you know you should drive on the left, and we both know that we know, that is a seamless social interaction because there's just this assumption of a common knowledge on both sides. And that is sort of what emerges here with this question about the presidency, is that there is a greater degree of non-racial commonality than what is suspected, leading to that common knowledge not being entirely acknowledged and secure, creating unnecessary suspicion and tension. It is further important to note that the presidency isn't just a service provider. We have asked a question similar to this in the past. We've applied it to teachers, we've applied it to doctors, and in all those cases, we found similar majorities in favor of a non-racial meritocratic preference. However, the president is more than just a service provider. The president is also the head of state and not just the head of government. So to a remarkable extent, the head of state, the representative symbol of South Africa alongside the flag and the national anthem, is by South Africans not an exclusively racialized concept. That is a very welcome finding and reflects that upstream link of South Africans rejecting a racialized and a racially active state of division and detriment. Then, once we accept that in terms of political legitimacy and the state's legitimacy in acting in a racial manner, once we appreciate that that actually isn't as firmly ensconced as even South Africans believe, but certainly as our politics would suggest, we can then emerge into a situation where South Africans regard politics from the function of state to the highest office of state in a moderate, non-racial manner. We then move on to the topic of race relations, inequality, and the route beyond racial division. We asked South Africans to indicate whether they agree or disagree with the following statement. The different races need each other for progress, and there should be full opportunity for people of all colors. An 89% majority agreeing with that statement. As I said earlier, between 8 and 9 out of every 10 South Africans endorse this overtly non-racial and moderate position of common opportunity and common progress. If we then add to that a sequel question in terms of some policy expansion, we asked them to state whether they agree or disagree with the statement, with better education and more jobs, the present inequality between the races will steadily disappear, with 76% agreeing with that statement and 23% disagreeing with that statement. And just to give some context, this again isn't just a unique finding in one race group. It is, to coin a phrase, broad-based. 87% of white South Africans endorse this approach of better education and more jobs to eradicate racial inequality. 80% of Indian South Africans, 76% of colored South Africans, and 75% of Black South Africans. These implications the implications in terms of race relations, inequality, and a route beyond racial division are quite simple. South Africans are more united in their socioeconomic aspirations than divided by racial grievance. Where the public sees a credible route beyond inequality, it sees that route in schools, jobs, growth, and shared opportunity. And it is no coincidence, if we were to step back and look at the politics of it, that at the time of the 2004 general election, when the ANC won an astonishing 70% of the vote, it was after a decade of delivering improvements with regards to schools, jobs, growth, and shared opportunity. And this is a refrain that you might be familiar with if this isn't your first polling interaction with the IRR, that material circumstance is critical to political decision making. So it is to the discredit of particularly the ANC that by moving away from this sort of framework of shared socioeconomic aspiration that secured them 7 out of every 10 votes in the 2004 election, this is a party that is currently roughly half that size with 40 or so percent of the vote. It doesn't indicate a perfect non-racialism or a non-racial utopia, but it does indicate that shared socioeconomic aspirations, rather than divisive racial grievances, ought or can form the basis of political rhetoric and success, the type of which secured the ANC such an astonishing election result 22 years ago. But it's not all sunshine and roses, and many of our critics quite often accuse us of rigging the data to just polish this perfect picture of South African racial harmony. That is simply not the case. Neither that we polish the data, nor that South Africa is a place of perfect racial harmony. As a lived reality, we are South Africans. Have you personally experienced any form of racism in the last 5 years? 44% say yes, 55% say no. Given the margin of error in this poll is 3 points, the yes answer could be as high as 47 or as low as 41, and the no answer could be as high as 58 or as low as 52. So when we assume sort of a worst case and a conservative, prudent scenario, we could be in a situation where 47% of South Africans have experienced racism in the last 5 years and 52% have not. That is very close to a 50-50 split, indicating that race relations and racism is nothing to be sneered at. It is a lived experience for half, at least 44%, but I think we can round it up credibly to half, 1 out of every 2 South Africans. But what is critical here is to understand the nature of racism. It is a lazy trope of analysis from the far left and the far right that racism is a unilinear concept in any society, that it flows only from white to black or black to white, whatever the case may be. The data in this survey shows that not to be the case. Let me get to that in a moment about my racial point. I seem to have messed up my own order here, but I'll get to the racial point in a moment. What is very interesting, that is worth noting, is how monthly income correlates almost perfectly to an experience of racism. If you look there at monthly household income of below 2,000 Rand a month, only 30% of South Africans report, yes, they have experienced racism in the last 5 years, and 70% say no. That rises, those relations change, going from 2,000 to 8,000 Rand a month, 8,000 to 20 and 20 and above. Now, there are quite a few factors that play into this. Number one, is the obvious factor that the poorest people are quite often those most excluded from shared society. If you are poor, black, rural South African, the chances of you encountering a white South African to be discriminated against or to be the victim of racism is, in a daily, day-to-day sense, quite remote. So, of course, we shouldn't overread the data. It is clear, however, that there are levels here of racial experience. The first being that exclusion naturally leads to less engagement with other identities. And that explains why, as people move into the more sophisticated, or more the higher socioeconomic status of an integrated socioeconomic society, that rises. Competition escalates, encounters with other identities escalate. So that is sort of a normal expectation. But what should not be missed here is also the policy flavor. Those earning less than 2,000 Rand a month are those not exposed to the benefits or detriments of a policy like BEE in the main. As employment equity and BEE policies rise in socioeconomic presence and salience, so too do experiences of racism. So we should be very cognizant of why we are seeing an escalation of racist experiences in coordination or in concert with higher struts on the socioeconomic ladder, and be aware of the very likely role that racialized policy plays in this regard. This is further sort of strengthened by the finding if we look at employment status. Owners of businesses in the formal economy responsible for implementing policies like employment equity, BEE, responsible or engaged in applying for tenders that make use of race-based procurement preferences, report, in terms of employment status, the highest level of racial experience. This is quite clearly another indication in the direction of policy, racialized policy here, playing a role in the experience of racism. Because if we look at those not looking for work, we see a 30%, 70% relation, exactly the same relation as we see in the previous slide of a monthly income below 20,000 Rand, with that divide changing in terms of the formal economy. Then we get to the racialized point. Now, here it is crucial to appreciate that the majority, the only group where there's a majority saying, yes, I have experienced racism in the last 5 years, is that of white South Africans on 58%. Now, when we talk about race in South Africa, it is quite often rather superficial and tropish, where it is either a question of black victimhood and white supremacy, or white victimhood and black supremacy. The fact that we can see a more complex, a more nuanced picture in terms of the experiences of what people consider racism is a rejection of a unilinear form of racial discrimination. This undermines the argument of systemic black supremacy or systemic white supremacy being the simplistic and reductionistic explanation of racism in South Africa. But when we go beyond just the personal experience of racism, which is perhaps the most worrying finding in this survey, despite racism being an almost 50-50 issue of experience on yes and no in the last 5 years, we see a wholesale rejection of the political weaponization of race. We ask South Africans, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? All this talk of racism and colonialism is by politicians who are trying to find excuses for their own failures. 70% reject the idea or agree with the statement, therefore rejecting the political rhetoric on racialized weaponization. So we should be cognizant here of a dual reality existing. And as the data shows, this rejection of political rhetoric based on race isn't just coming from one population group, it is broad-based. What does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the implication that we sit with this dual reality of racism as a genuine societal experience, yet linked to socioeconomic integration that has been racified or racialized by policy and by history. If the workplace is racialized, every slight, professional or otherwise, every promotion or the loss of such or the denial of such can too easily be linked to policy. It is creating a space where grievance far too easily finds fertile soil purely because it is state intervention on a race basis that South Africans do not want, as the earlier finding of 70% rejecting the four racial categories and their use for state intervention shows. So we have this dual reality of lived experiences of racism, fueled by socioeconomic integration or exclusion in terms of the experience of slights in the workplace. But at the same time, South Africans do not like racialized politics as a rhetorical arena. Now, that, of course, doesn't negate the fact that people might still use and rely on race in their personal consideration of identity, and therefore their identity of race links to their political support. We can't exclude that the data here is silent on that. But what the data clearly shows is that while South Africans experience racism to an alarming extent, they do not like it being used by politicians when they experience the failures of governance. Now, the data, therefore, we say, weaken the claim that race-based administration is the natural answer to exclusion, and that the data is or are inconsistent with the notion that economic exclusion and poverty are the result of persistent systemic racism. If poor South Africans were of the view that their poverty on a daily basis is caused by racism, we would not have seen 70% of poor South Africans saying that they have not experienced racism in the last 5 years. This is a vital finding, and it goes to the heart of race-based transformation policies. Those policies assume racial grievance and economic exclusion run together. Yet, we can see racial grievance at the highest levels of earnings and its absence at the lowest levels of earnings. We cannot, therefore, persist with the simplistic notion that economic exclusion is purely race-based. The poorest report the lowest instances of personal experience of racism, while the better off, the best off, report the highest. That is inconsistent, utterly inconsistent with a view of an economy that is systemically racist, because we would expect to see the opposite if that were to be the case. If poor South Africans woke up every day with the understanding or the view that their poverty and their exclusion is caused by the color of their skin, then we would see a much higher reportage of racial or racist incidents than we do. That is why it is crucial to take from this section the finding that policies like BEE, like employment equity, that assume economic exclusion is causally linked and experientially linked to racial discrimination and the experience of racism, that is rejected wholesale by the people of South Africa, especially the poorest. A final section of today's presentation is on race and party politics. Here, it is very interesting that similar to economic standing, income levels, and employment status, corresponding to a significant degree with experiences of racism, it is telling that the four parties with the highest reported experience of racism are, in order, the Freedom Front Plus, on 64% of Freedom Front Plus voters saying that they have experienced racism in the last 5 years, MK on 63%, the PA on 56%, and the EFF on 50%. These are the parties, for better or worse, most broadly associated with grievance-based politics. So we are in an interesting situation where there might be either both a chicken or an egg, or whatever came first. Are we seeing voters with racial grievance baggage coalescing around parties based on racial grievance, or are we seeing racial grievance politics leading to a rhetoric that leads to those convictions? We don't know. The data can't tell us that. But what we do see is that racialized politics correlate very closely with an experience of racism, and that the two main parties, the ANC and the DA, or not main parties, pardon me, the two largest parties, have substantial overlap when it comes to non-racial instincts. You will see there on the screen, the third bullet, DA voters are more strongly non-racial than ANC voters, but the difference from ANC voters is mostly one of degree, not a completely different worldview. It is a complex picture of race, but it is a useful one to, firstly, understand that racism cannot be dismissed, nor can it be defined in a purely unilinear way of blacks versus whites, or whites versus blacks, or whatever the constellation might be. Thirdly, we are seeing a politics of grievance coalescing with experiences of racism, and we see surprising common ground between long-time oppositional parties in the ANC and the DA. But that final point is perhaps the most important to take away from this particular section. The core implication from this section is that South African politics operates in a public mood with more common ground on coexistence, fairness, and upliftment than the political class usually admits. That concludes, therefore, the analysis of findings. Let me move to our final conclusions. Firstly, the IRR's 2026 polling shows that shows South Africa as a country under racial strain, but not moving towards racial collapse. A broad majority still prefers coexistence, upliftment, and a more non-racial future. Most South Africans want opportunity expanded through jobs and education, not continued race-based allocation by the state. The biggest gap, therefore, when it comes to the state of race and race relations in South Africa is between public instinct and political practice. Society is often less racial than the system governing it. And this is my key takeaway from this report in those last two bullet points. South Africa does not need to create a desire for non-racialism. That desire already exists. It exists in 66% of South Africans saying that the race of the president is essentially irrelevant. It exists in 89% of South Africans saying that the races need each other and that there should be full opportunity for people of all races. It exists in the 70% rejecting the Population Registration Act, the persistent Population Registration Act categories of racial classification. It is visible in the 70% who reject racial political rhetoric. And it is seen in the 76% who hold socioeconomic upliftment through education and jobs as a route to the disappearance of racial inequality. So what then? If this non-racial desire is pre-existent, is in the ether, as it were, in the bloodstream of the South African body civic, the conclusion must be that what is lacking is a broad-based acknowledgement of already existing moderate sentiments and attitudes on race relations and a corresponding political adaptation. We are those, oh yeah, I sort of got carried away, and so did my mic. We are those cars driving towards each other on the highway of our lived reality. I know in my vehicle that I prefer a non-racial lane. You know in your vehicle that you prefer a non-racial lane. But as we pass each other, we become suspicious, tense, and unnecessarily so. Because the reality is that we agree, but we don't know that we agree. If we can know that agreement on moderate racial sentiments is not the outlier, is not the family secret, is not something that should go unsaid in a social context, then we can see an adaptation and a corresponding reaction from political rhetoric and policy that fairly reflects the innate moderation of South Africans on the issue of race. We sit therefore with an acknowledgement problem, a preaching to the converted problem. And perhaps let me end with this. And the late, great former CEO of the Institute of Race Relations, John Cain Berman, consistently argued that South Africans and those who believe that South Africans who believe in non-racialism, in moderate positions, should never cease preaching to the converted. The IRR and other entities should never cease preaching to the converted. And I think we find in the data a validation of that position, because it is only through preaching to the converted that, to stretch this metaphor perhaps beyond breaking point, we can realize that we are singing from the same hymn sheet. South Africa's crisis when it comes to race relations is one of acknowledgement instead of suspicion, of commonality instead of divided assumptions. That conclusion leaves us with a path to travel forwards, not purely political or policy, but in terms of our civic responsibility, to understand that we are travelers who understand the rules of the road more than we might suspect. Those moments of unnecessary societal friction can be addressed if we start acknowledging that we are singing from the same hymn sheet and forcing political rhetoric and the policy landscape to adapt in line with a rejection of the racial rhetoric and divisions we so abhor. I thank you for your time this morning. I will gladly now take a few questions. Let me open the comment section here. It is my understanding that we still have a further few minutes. I will try to be as effective and inclusive as possible with these questions. Let me scroll to the top here. Fiona Semple asked, what was the percentage range of races that responded to your survey? This considering the result of the survey. Let me call up let me get the precise numbers on my screen for you, then I can give you that information. Population group, respondents who self-classify as Black, 77.2, colored, 9, Indian, 2.7, white, 11.1. I hope that answers the questions. Let me scroll further to our question section. Sandra Blackie has just asked, is this moderate sentiment new or has it been this way a decade ago? From what I can tell in terms of the data, it is not new, but it isn't as strong as it might have been, I think, a decade ago. The reportage of racism over the last few years, if my memory serves, has pointed in a direction of slightly worsening race relations and the experience of racism. So this isn't just a simplistic, oh, it's been great and will ever be thus. But it is useful to appreciate that the a moderate majority is not a new phenomenon. And we have some very, very strong data points to point to this. We can use the 1992 referendum on a negotiated end to the apartheid dispensation. But as I'm a sucker for opinion polling, I would share with you a poll that was carried out in March 1987 amongst the white respondents, that found that 27%, only 27%, so roughly 1 out of every 4 white South Africans at the time of 1987, a tense time for race relations and politics in South Africa, only 27% supported the Group Areas Act, one of the 4 or 5 pillar laws of the apartheid dispensation. So even back then, 1987, we see a sort of a moderate view emerging quite clearly, even if it is 5 years ahead of the 1992 referendum. And to add complexity to the human psyche and human nature, 1987 is, of course, also the year that the Conservative Party, the Kapia, becomes the official opposition in that year's election. So it's not a straightforward simplistic, the moderate majority is there and it will forever be. As I say, that majority seems to be chipping away at the sides over the last few years. I think that is entirely to be expected given the socioeconomic pressures and the rhetoric that comes from more populist parties that have emerged, but also it is a strong moderate, there's a strong moderate legacy going back as far as 1987, 1992. Even if we want to be very, very bold, we can go back to the 1948 election, where the National Party won the election, but with only, I think, about 37% of the vote. So we should view these things in the round, not take the moderate majority for granted. I think it is there. I think it is substantial. I think it is formidable. But if not mobilized politically, I fear that it might not be as reliable as it has been. I see Jill Crawford asks, apartheid under 2 consecutive nationalist governments. Well, that certainly is one way of seeing it. I would be careful, however, of using that framing. It is a source of persistent annoyance to myself, and I'm here speaking for myself only, that we too glibly compare post-1994 failures of racialized policy with pre-1994 failures of racialized policy. Then it is, I think, uncontestable that there are philosophical points of departure that are similar. The acceptance of a state with the capacity to classify and benefit by race, I think, is a point of philosophical departure. Racial bean counting, pencil tests, even a racial hierarchy. I think, of course, that philosophical framework of an NP-ANC commonality exists. But let's be very, very careful not to extrapolate from the philosophical grounding to the absolute lived experience. South Africa today is not an apartheid nation. White South Africans today have significantly more rights, more socioeconomic rights, absolute and relative, than Black South Africans had under apartheid. I think it is glib and somewhat trite to too simplistically compare the two with each other. Take, for example, freedom of speech, massively healthier today than it was 40, 50 years ago. And it is also perhaps worth appreciating that the post-apartheid economic settlement was of great benefit to white South Africans who saw their relative wealth in terms of global comparative purchasing power and consumer spending grow, escalate far beyond what it had been under apartheid. Free markets tend to work. If I'm in a country where the government is telling me as a white man can only do business with 3 out of every 10 people in my society, that's economically damaging. So apartheid under 2 consecutive nationalist governments, I can see where that claim comes from, but I think it is a claim that not necessarily helps us give explanatory scope to what South Africa can achieve, given what this data shows us of a commonality. I see Brayton Cupido asks, why is there an image of Panyaza Lesufi, Premier of Gauteng, on the front page of the report, but no mention of him in the report? This was a rather deliberate and hopefully engaging or intriguing decision of mine. If it backfires spectacularly, it is my decision and my fault. But it is to indicate, I think, that South Africans can see streams of politics that differ, and that I think Mr. Lesufi, in his various roles of office, has been a public symbol of a very particular form of racialized political rhetoric, and that South Africans should appreciate that the abstract findings we have here about the rejection of race-based grievance politics isn't just theoretical or abstract. There are people who purport and support this sort of politics, and I think it is a fair argument to say that Mr. Lesufi is one of them, and therefore, whilst he is not mentioned in the report, his views are certainly investigated within it. Let me quickly scroll through the questions, perhaps for a last question. Is it possible that the personal racism claim, asks Sandra Blackie, experience is due to exclusion policies? It is entirely possible. It would be rather bold of me to read too much into the data, but I think the correlation of the levels at which exclusionist race-based policies interact with South Africans match up with where people report high levels of racial experiences. So I would venture a guess, a credible and rational guess, in the direction of yes. Right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that has been an enlightening and an interesting session and webinar this morning. The slides will shortly be available online. The report is already available online. It is free. It is fascinating. I certainly found it fascinating. Let me put it this way: the data is fascinating. The guy who wrote it might be less so, but I hope I did fair by the data and by the South African people. If you appreciate and like what we do here at the IRR, please consider supporting us. This type of research, we feel, isn't being done by anyone else, and liberalism, in the sense of acknowledging non-racialism as the basis for a healthy society, deserves a strong voice, because a country that is prosperous, that is free, where everyone can equally access the assets of our society through their own initiative and their property rights, their freedom of speech, well, that is what we think South Africa can be. That is why we have started the What SA Can Be issue driving initiative, where we promote polling like this, where we promote pieces of draft legislation like the No More Race Laws bill that squarely sits within the moderate majority of South Africans' viewpoints. If you like the work we do, if you want that work to continue, for this message to travel further and faster, click support the IRR and help us join Team What SA Can Be. That is how we make a difference and how we build this country together and make the aspirations that we see in the data a concrete and clear reality. I thank you for your time. I'll see you again. God bless.